Man, it's already been another year. It's crazy how fast time is flying, but I hope you all enjoyed holidays and New Year with family and friends, or just had a relaxing time at least. And yeah, first video of the year. And today we're going to talk about a live service going by the name Splitgate, which I don't think is enjoying a particularly great New Year. So Splitgate, for those who don't know, is essentially a first-person shooter with portals. The first game, once upon a time was really well received overall. Recently, it's been seeing a couple mixed reviews, but this is a game that kind of died off because the developers decided that they want to make a sequel and focus on that. Now, that sequel, once upon a time, was known as Splitgate 2, but things went awry on that front, and they actually decided to unrelease the game and then re-release it as Splitgate Arena Reloaded. And unfortunately, that's not been going particularly well. Now, in terms of critical reception of the re-release, we're seeing that recent reviews are sitting at mostly positive, with a lot of people actually liking a lot of the changes that were made in response to complaints surrounding Splitgate 2. But this is very much a case of far too little too late. So you can see right here, Splitgate 2 releasing for the first time, and the all-time peak concurrent player numbers sat at, a little less than 26,000 players. And that very quickly dipped into, the 4 digits, then into the 3 digits. And this is a game that ultimately never recovered. And the kicker is that at launch, Splitgate 2 actually did significantly worse than Splitgate 1 did. You can see right here that when Splitgate 1 fully launched, it launched with an all-time peak concurrent player number on Steam of, almost 68,000 players. Whereas right here with Splitgate 2, or, Splitgate Arena Reloaded, just, a little less than 26,000 players. That's quite the stark difference. And so with this re-release of Splitgate 2 in the form of Splitgate Arena Reloaded, the hope was that it would win back the player base, that all of the fixes and overhauls in response to community feedback would allow this game to thrive, and it would allow for essentially a major comeback. But that is not at all what is going on. You can see right here, looking at Steam charts, the original release of the game, and then it went back to beta at around this time period. And the re-release, you can see, happened here on December 15th, 2025. And the launch already was looking pretty rough with, a little less than 2,300 players at its all-time peak. And it's only been dipping since, with only, now hundreds of players coming back to play this game. This is plain and simply not sustainable for any live service. And you can see right here, even when this game was known as Splitgate 2, how quickly that player number dropped off. And we came to a point where it was just not a sustainable live service. The fact that we're so quickly reaching numbers of old Splitgate 2 already suggests that this live service is likely doomed to shut down in the not so distant future. So it launched, it kind of died, went back into development, went back into beta, it relaunched, and then died again. There were just a lot of things that went against Splitgate 2. Just its focus was more like trend chasing. Instead of sticking to what made Splitgate 1 special, what people loved about that game, they decided to kind of do what a lot of other games are doing. And that ultimately ended up angering a lot of Splitgate 1 fans, or at the very least, made them lose interest in the sequel. And so Splitgate Arena Reloaded, the re-release, was all about essentially making Splitgate 2 more like Splitgate 1 and giving fans what they wanted out of a sequel for this series. And so, yeah, again, the critical reception for people who are playing this game is more positive. But in terms of the total number of players engaging with this game, due to the fact that the live service market is so oversaturated, there's so many, first-person shooter games competing for people's limited time, Splitgate Arena Reloaded ultimately just could not make much of a splash in this overcrowded landscape. The fact that it made a bad first impression lost a lot of people, and even with its attempted comeback, ultimately, again, it's just too little too late. A lot of people have moved on, and Splitgate Arena Reloaded, the re-release of Splitgate 2, just doesn't do enough to, make it something that entices people to switch from what is their normal live service that they come back to day in and day out. It's very difficult to pull people away from, 1 or 2 live services that they've invested all of their time and money into. Splitgate Arena Reloaded, ultimately, despite its portal aspects being really cool and unique, doesn't do enough to stand out from the pack. Beyond the bad first impression that Splitgate 2 made, beyond the fact that it made a grave miscalculation by chasing trends instead of, making Splitgate 1 but better, there's also the fact that the CEO of 1047 Games, the development studio behind Splitgate, came out like really overconfidently, like just cockily came out on stage at Summer Game Fest and talked about making FPS great again, wearing a hat that, obviously has a lot of political implications, pissing off a lot of people. But really the main thing is like he was never ultimately able to live up to that, make FPS great again slogan. He like dissed Call of Duty on stage and talked about the grave state that first person shooters are in right now, and how he was going to be the savior of that, but the end result was anything but. And that was kind of the part that made this whole situation all the more humiliating. And then in response to the make FPS great again situation, he talked about how he's not here to apologize and how he believes that the state of multiplayer FPS games is tragically stale and how he's going to be the one to change all that. But again, Splitgate 2 ultimately didn't. It actually regressed in terms of what this game should have been. It did not adhere to the Splitgate formula that fans of the series loved, and it ended up killing the series. And then there's the fact that he later came out and changed his stance yet again, saying that, I'm making no excuses now. He did apologize after all. And so, yeah, the way he handled communications and PR just made for really bad optics that Splitgate didn't need shortly before launch. And then when Splitgate 2 did launch, the player numbers were so bleak that by July of 2025, Splitgate 2 had to unlaunch, essentially go back to beta, and on top of that, 1047 Games had to lay off a bunch of folks in order to be able to sustain themselves. All of this was relayed via the following social media post from the Splitgate development team, talking about how they finally heard, players' feedback, how they agree with players, how they're going back to beta, and how they're gonna, engage with the community, do more play tests, so on and so forth. And, I can commend any efforts to try to rectify mistakes, but making a comeback from such a devastating situation is just incredibly difficult. It is such an uphill battle. Few games can truly make a comeback, from a disastrous launch. We've seen it happen here and there, but that's, more the exception than the norm. We've seen similar circumstances with live services like Amazon's Crucible way back in the day. This is a game that actually went back into closed beta after its launch was so disastrous. And then I believe it's a game that ultimately never did relaunch because Amazon just wanted to cut their losses. Perhaps a more striking parallel is Multiverses, which went through the exact same journey that Splitgate did. This is a game that launched with monetization systems live and everything. I mean, they will say that, well, it was technically a beta, but it was as good as launched because the monetization systems were fully intact. And then after a while, the player base just significantly dipped and nosedive. Then they decided to unlaunch the game and work on it from behind the scenes. They change engines and did a bunch of stuff. And then they relaunched it only for people to find that this new version of Multiverses was less feature complete and in some ways worse. And all of that ultimately ended in tragedy, as you can see right here on SteamDB. Looking at the Steam charts, here's the first launch of the game. Pretty great all-time peak and current player numbers, but the drop-off, it was such a massive nosedive that led to the unlaunching of the game. And then when it relaunched, once again, we got pretty good peaks over here, but all of that dipped very quickly. And now nobody's really playing this game because this game has announced that it will be shutting down its live service component, that it will be going offline. While Multiverses can still be played, single player, its online features have all been eradicated. Now, Splitgate 2, or, Splitgate Arena Reloaded as it's known now, hasn't announced any kind of shutdown or anything, but there is little doubt in my mind that that is imminent, that is coming sooner rather than later, because the player numbers shown here are just plain and simply not sustainable. You can't only have a couple hundred players playing at the same time. Splitgate is a free-to-play game, which means that when it comes to making money, this game entirely relies on the volume of people playing and engaging with the title and the volume of people who are, engaging with the monetization systems. When there's such few players, it means that there's not going to be a whole lot of activity with the monetization systems that allow this game to make the money to be able to sustain, all of the expenses that come with keeping a live service game, alive. So yeah, Splitgate 2 or Splitgate Arena Reloaded, it's as good as dead. And for all of the, claims that were made by the CEO that they're here to make FPS great again, coming out on stage, trying to be essentially a Joseph Ferris, but without actually being able to deliver on the promises and the bold claims made, The end result is a live service, yet another live service that has ultimately ended in failure, that has stoked the flames too much. Another live service afflicted by just how competitive and oversaturated this market is, combined with major PR missteps as well as trend chasing that has ultimately alienated much of its community. And even with its attempt to come back, to overhaul, and to give the community what they want, how late that came and how it combined with all of the other negative elements that made this game face an uphill battle for it to make a comeback. What we're ultimately looking at here is a game whose comeback attempt will likely not succeed. And this is a game studio that will likely suffer financially quite significantly. They've already done mass layoffs as a result of the first release's flop, and now the second release garnering little to no attention, and the player base being as minimal as it is right now. I cannot imagine that 1047 Games is going to be in a good financial position. I don't know if the studio will ultimately shut down or if they'll have one more attempt in them to try to make a new game that will allow the studio to recover financially if that launch is successful, or if the damage is so significant with Splitgate's flop that it will ultimately bankrupt the studio. But yeah, there you have it, folks. That is the tale of the rise and then the dramatic and sustained fall of Splitgate. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on Splitgate as a game. If you've checked it out before, do you like the game and the way it played? What do you think about the transition from Splitgate 1 to Splitgate 2 and now to Splitgate Arena Reloaded? What do you think Splitgate needs to do to come back, and whether there's any hope at all? Or do you think that, this series is done and it's as good as dead? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated, on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.